16 and verse 31. It says, "The hoary head is a crown of glory, if it be found in the way of righteousness." The hoary head. I want to talk to you about old age. I want to talk to you about growing old. And I know that those of you under 40, you just say, well, wake me up when this is over. I was in a church in Tucson recently. I think at one time it was probably a very, very large congregation. I think probably when we were there, they probably had about 600. And I think the building would probably handle 2,000. And as I looked around over the congregation, I would say 90% of the people were white-headed. And that's not a good sign for a church, for its future anyway. Praise the Lord for all the senior saints that were there. I'm sure they had been there many, many years, probably grew up in that church, and it was their home church. But folks have a way of dying, and if you don't bring in new blood into a church, it is doomed. I guess you know that. Just like in your family name, you have to have new blood, or pretty soon your name is gone. And the same way with your own health. When your body stops making good, new and healthy blood, you're in trouble. So a church has to have new blood. A Sunday school has to have new blood to continue to grow and to stay vital, to stay active, to stay alive. That is the key, to tell you the truth. But we all get old. Churches, organizations, countries, buildings, everything gets old. But I want to talk to you about growing old gracefully. When I thought about this, I thought, I'm not old enough to preach this sermon. But nevertheless, I think the Bible has a lot to say about it. And, sometimes seniors are criticized by younger people, and rightfully so, because it's amazing how sometimes people as they get older, they seem to become more cantankerous. Their bitterness becomes more evident. And someone said some older women and men, as they grow bitter with age. And it says the more their teeth drop out, the more biting they get. And that's the way some people are. They're very harsh. They're very biting, if you know what I mean, in their words. They're very critical. And but I don't think that just happened because of their age. I think it had to do with the way they aged and the way they were perhaps in the first half of their life. And unless one understands, I think unless a person understands and applies the certain principles of life, they'll wind up a miserable, old, bitter, and cantankerous person. And someone has said most men spend the first half of their life making the second half miserable. And there's a lot of truth to that. And usually the misery of your life will come after your 40s. And because that's when, we go through stages. And when you're raising small children, as long as everybody's in good health, everything really is okay. It's okay. If your children have good health, you can weather just about everything else. You can handle the finances and you can handle everything else. But of course, if you have a child that, and children that there's some serious illness, then of course that is a real heartbreak to many. But what I'm saying is this: I was a real good parent until I had teenagers, and I knew exactly how people ought to raise kids. But I found out that as children get a little bit older, they have a will of their own. And usually when children get to be in their teens, their parents are usually in their 40s. There are other physical problems that come at that time of life as well. And so that is usually when the real challenge in marriage comes, is in those in those 40s, the early 40s, and sometimes folks don't get through them without some problems. And then you get beyond that, you start having some health problems. Your body starts failing to cooperate with you. For instance, in my mind, the truth is, I feel young in my mind. I don't feel old in my mind. But I can't get my body to cooperate with my mind. I was just going down some steps a while ago, and every time I took a step down with my left leg, it was pain, And so we get old, and that's okay. That's wonderful if you can get old. If you live long enough to get old, then certainly God has blessed you with a long life. But, you don't want to come to the end of your life to where nobody can stand to be around you, to where you're just bitter. I see a lot of old people, and, they're jealous of young couples. They're jealous of young people. They think everybody's out to get them. They think everybody's out to take advantage of them. And they probably think that because that's the way they lived in the first 30 years of their life, taking advantage of everybody else. I'm not sure. But, if you think everybody's out to take advantage of you, probably that's what was on your mind. But the question is, how are you going to spend the first half of your life? What kind of attitude are you going to have? What are you going to put into your life? It is really tragic today to see people by the time many of them are in their 30s, they're shot. They're shot from drugs or alcohol. And it's a real problem. It's an epidemic. I've had more than one police officer say that if it wasn't for drugs and alcohol, we would have practically no crime. Almost everything. Here's it. People either commit the crime while they're under the influence of alcohol or drugs, or they commit the crime to get more alcohol and drugs, you see. And, it just, I want to get on a soapbox every once in a while about this going after the cigarette industry and avoiding the alcohol industry. Do you ever stop to think what's behind all this? It's still money. It's all about money. But more people, cirrhosis of the liver, you know where it comes from? It comes from drinking alcohol. See? But you don't hear anybody in the medical field, anybody protesting, anybody talking. It's all about cigarettes. And the reason for that is because the government is trying to take over the cigarette industry. They're not opposed to cigarettes. They're not opposed to you smoking. Don't kid yourself. Most of those who are lobbying smoke themselves. Bill Clinton smoked cigars. You knew that. He did. And a lot of these guys smoke. They're just, it's all about money, and the government is trying to confiscate the tobacco industry. They tried to get the health business, and they've already got the alcohol business. They're all government liquor stores, don't you? It's all about money. And so if you think it's about safety and you think it's about health, you're out of your mind, you see. But you need to stay away from that stuff. You need to avoid it, because in the end, it's going to be like a rattlesnake that turns around and bites you, and it's going to destroy you, you see. It will destroy you. It'll kill you. It'll destroy your relationships with people. You'll lose your job. You'll lose your health. You'll lose your family. And probably in despair, you'll lose your life. If somebody doesn't kill you, you take your own life. So, don't waste these years of your life. The devil wants them, but God wants your youth as well. And I get weary of people that have come to the end of their life and they've burnt every bridge. They've burnt everything out. They've burnt out all their brain cells, and then they want to give their life to God. Well, why don't you give your life to God while you still got some brain cells, and you still got some strength, and you still got some youth, and you know? And I'm thankful for every person that comes to Christ. I'm thankful for every person who's, even though they've made shipwreck of their life, they come to Christ. I'm not unthankful for that. But listen, God deserves more. He deserves the best, doesn't he? So don't go out and waste your life and then come back, and folks think they can sow wild oats and then pray for a crop failure. It just doesn't work that way. So you can grow old gracefully. You can do that. And there are many examples in the Bible of that. And I'm thinking of a person by the age of Moses. When Moses was 120 years of age, he was still the meekest man on the earth. Did you know the Bible said Moses was the meekest man that ever lived? Now you think of him. Sometimes people accent the couple of failures that Moses had. When he got mad and smote the rock, of course, that was a major mistake. But that's one mistake. And it was a big mistake. But Moses was the meekest man, the Bible says, on the earth. And, we make fun of Moses sometimes when he said, I can't speak, I'm not eloquent. But it wasn't all excuses. He meant it. God overcame those weaknesses in his life. But he wasn't just alibying, He wasn't just trying to hide from God. I don't believe he was. I think he believed what he said. And God said, hey, I made your mouth. I can take care of that. But, he was a great man. And he was great when he was old because he was a great man when he was young. And was great in those maturing years. And, pretty soon, they say, the way the tree is bent, that's the way it grows. And you are going to be tomorrow exactly what you are today. Not much is going to change. And so you want to make sure that that you're learning the right habits and that you are fellowshipping with the right people. Joshua, when he addressed the elders of Israel, he was a man that you see the graciousness in his life. Let's go to Joshua chapter 24. And you'll see something about his spirit there. 24, and look down about verse 15. And this is his farewell speech. And he said, but if it seem evil to you to serve the Lord, choose you this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the flood, or the gods of the Amorite in whose land you dwell, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And here is a man in his senior years telling Israel to make a decision, but he's going to continue to serve God. And I don't believe that you reach an age in your life when you're to stop serving God. You may have to change your vocation. You may have to change your place of residence, but you do not have to change your commitment to God. Senior citizens ought to find a ministry. You haven't put in your time. I hear folks say, well, I put in my time, now we'll let the young people do it. Now, that's not scriptural. What if the young people said, well, we're young now, we'll wait until we're old, and then we'll do it? No. I'm so thankful that Mrs. Krause, almost up to the time she died, she still loved to sing in the choir. Mrs. Parks, you'll never get her out of the Sunday school class. I think she's teaching 8th grade girls or something like that, I'm afraid to guess her age, afraid she'll whip me. But I know she's a senior. And but here she is. She goes on the bus with the young people and takes trips with them, She told me the other day, she said, I'm getting ready to go to Louisiana and Texas, going down to see my daughters and my sisters and so on. I don't think she knows how old she is. And pray she never finds out. But, you can serve God. You could work in the nursery. And if you are a gracious older person, think what an example you could be to young men and women. You say, what a testimony you could be. And we need people we can look up to. We need people who set the example. Believe it or not, young people do look up to older people. They watch them, and they make judgments and they make decisions. And so we need to make sure that we do the right thing. Dorcas was a person that left a great testimony in the book of Acts. Simon Peter, he was an elder. He was rebuked by the Apostle Paul. Rather than getting bitter, now here's Simon Peter. He knew who he was. Why? He'd spent more time with Jesus than the Apostle Paul. He was handpicked. And yet when Paul came up to, or when Peter was at Antioch and he saw the behavior of the Apostle Paul, Paul saw the behavior of Peter, Paul rebuked him. And most people, if you rebuke them, they're done with you for life. They get bitter, and they never get over it. And but I know Simon Peter got over it, and he accepted it. No doubt changed his behavior, and he grew old gracefully. He was up in years, and he probably appreciated what Paul had said to him, especially when he understood the situation. But it doesn't take much sometimes to create a bitter spirit in our heart. And sometimes things happen in our youth. And there are folks maybe in this church tonight that something happened in your childhood. And you just keep harboring it, and you just keep bringing it up. And even though it's not a blazing fire, it's down there smoldering. And every once in a while, when a little oxygen hits it, it flares up, Or maybe it was a ex-husband or an ex-wife or an employer or a pastor or somebody that disappointed you and hurt you. And you have a right, I guess, to get hurt, but you don't have a right to get bitter and to stay bitter. And you know why? Because you are the person being destroyed. The person you're bitter at first of all, doesn't know it and doesn't care, and they're probably skiing somewhere in Colorado. See? And you're just dying by the minute. It's not helping you. Get over it. Not for their sake, but for your sake. But it doesn't take much. And people just go on and on and on. And if you start dwelling on that thing, it's like a cancer. It's like a cancer that just eats and eats and eats, and it'll eat your soul out. And pretty soon you're an old person. And there was a family in this church, and I wouldn't tell you their names if you guessed them. But I would guess that she was, in her 50s, late 50s. And I knew them quite well. But I remember one time talking with them, and she cried as she talked about the way her mother had treated her. Her mother had told her back when she was a girl that they didn't want her. She wasn't wanted. Now that's a horrible, horrible, horrible thing. And no person should ever say that to anybody. But here this woman now, almost 60 years of age, is still crying. Still crying because as a little girl, her mother had told her that she didn't want her. Well, that's a scar that I'm not sure you ever recover from, you say. But you've got to, by the grace of God, no matter what people have said to you and done to you, you've got to, by the grace of God, you've got to get over it. And you need to do it as soon as you can, because as you get older, it becomes more difficult. As you keep playing that over and over and over, the ditch gets, the groove gets deeper and gets deeper and gets deeper. And pretty soon you can't get out of it. So get over it, amen? And you can do it by the grace of God. Moses, Joshua, Dorcas, and others, Simon Peter, I think are great examples of people who really could complain and justify bitterness in their life. I mean, Moses said, he could have said, hey, I didn't want this job. I didn't volunteer to take these people out of Egypt. You drafted me. You stop and think about it. He didn't volunteer. God overpowered him and drafted him to do it and then sent him out there. And Moses, if you remember, more than once said, I can't bear these people anymore. Matter of fact, he said, I can't take them anymore. He said, in fact, I've had it with them. And God said, I have too. Why don't you just step aside? I'll kill all of them. And Moses said, no, I don't want you to do that. He said, I don't want you to do that. And God didn't want to do it either, but he was testing him. But I'm just saying that if you look at these people in the Bible, folks, every one of them could look at something in their life and say, I have a right to be bitter. And we all do. It's easy to find something. I mean, people, they're upset about who their parents were. I didn't ask to be born in this family. You know, sometimes kids that are born in preachers' homes, they resent it. They don't like being preachers' kids because everybody picks on them. I'm sure the same thing's true probably many times with police officers. You know, kids, they're picked on and by other kids and say, you know, no, you can't go, you can't drive like that, you can't do that because, you know, your daddy's a policeman. And what it is, just a big temptation putting in front of the kid, daring them to do something. See? And so it's a real problem. And they get bitter I didn't ask to be born in this family. You know, I don't like being in a police officer's a home. I don't like being in a missionary's home. I don't like being a preacher's kid, you see, because everybody at the church says, you know, to my kids, people used to hold them up as an example in the classroom and say, you know, you're the preacher's kid. You ought to set the example and set up straight. And when a kid hears that pretty soon, he says, well, I wish I wasn't a preacher's kid, because they always expect me to set up straighter than everybody else, you see. And so it's true many times with the Christians, being raised in a Christian home. And so, you know, you could be bitter about that. You could be bitter about the kind of education or the way you moved around, or you could be bitter about your race or something, depending on the circumstances. But you see, we don't have any choices in these things. We don't have the choice of the family we're born into. We don't have choices about where we're born. We don't have a choice about who we are. We have choices about who we become, say. But I don't have a choice about who I am. And so we could all look at these things and say, well, so-and-so mistreated me, and get bitter. So there's so many examples in the Bible, but I'm just thinking about Brother Trent. What a wonderful man. What a wonderful man. I never saw him in all the years I was ever pastor. I never saw him raise his voice. Just always just steady. Great carpenter. Used to come here and work on the buildings all the time. Sunday morning, Sunday night, Thursday night, he and his wife were here all the time. Mrs. Krause, God bless her. To me, a saint, an angel, if you know what I mean. Just a breath of fresh air to be around. And to go into her little trailer up there. She loved to entertain. Just one of the sweetest women I've ever met, you know. And Sophie, I didn't know her for many years, but the little time that I knew her, what a blessing. And, of course, I've known Mrs. Parks for 30-something years. She thinks that I'm the greatest person that ever lived, and don't you ever tell her any different. She loves her preacher, and she will whip you if you don't watch what you say. But isn't it wonderful to be around some folks like that? Some folks that are a breath of fresh air. You know, they didn't just get that way. You know what? 10, 20, and 30 years ago, Mrs. Krause was a good lady. She was. She didn't just become good. Brother Trent was a good man, see. And so you can think of examples in your own life. And make it so that if the Lord tarries, somebody can look up to you, you know. But there are some principles. And you know, the Bible is very clear that whatever a man sows, that shall he also reap. Let's go to the book of Galatians. Let me just show you a verse or two here. In this day in which we live, that's Galatians chapter 6. You know, folks are sometimes confused about God's principle of operation today. But primarily, God is working through the principle of sowing and reaping. In other words, you will reap what you sow. And you have far more control, and I want to be careful how I say this because somebody else, but you have far more control over your life than you think you do. You have far more control over your attitude and over your earthly destiny than you think you do. You know, we used to, in Bible college, you know, we used to kind of slough off, you know, and then the day before the test, we all prayed real hard. And guess what happened? We flunked. Now, you say, I thought God answered prayer. Well, he does answer prayer. But God's not going to answer prayer contrary to the principles that he's implemented. Don't kid yourself. You're not going to go out here and live like the devil and then pray your way out of it. It's called sowing and reaping. And you pray and do right. You see. And here in Galatians chapter 6, verse 7, God said, be not deceived. We shouldn't deceive ourselves about this matter. And God is not mocked. And the idea here of mocking God is that you think you can do one thing and get a different result. Or that you can live a certain way and then you think, well, I'll pray at the 11th hour and God will deliver me out of this mess. But the chances are he will not. The chances are. Now, if you do things in foolishness or in ignorance and you're not intentionally doing these things, God might intervene. But if you're going the other way, it's like a guy standing on the railroad track and saying, Lord, I trust you and I'm praying that you'll stop this train. Well, he probably will about 100 miles down the track, you see. But it's called tempting the Lord. Thou shalt not tempt the Lord thy God. And so whatsoever a man sows, that shall he also reap. And someone has said, we reap what we sow. We reap after we sow. And we reap more than we sow. The Bible said, he that sows to the wind reaps the whirlwind. And you know that you just sow a few seed and you get a bushel full, right? And that's the way it is in life. Someone has said, what you and I do in moderation, our children will do in excess. Because they don't put that kind of value on what we're doing as far as, well, they're just doing it in moderation. They don't see that at all. You drink in moderation, they'll drink in excess. You cuss in moderation, they'll cuss in excess. And so what we sow, we reap. Verse 8, for he that soweth to the flesh shall of his flesh reap corruption. And so when you and I put the emphasis on the flesh and live for the flesh, corruption is going to come. He that sows to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting. Verse 9, and let us not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap, if we faint not. And, there are folks that they try to live for God, and after a few years, they've sent their kids to Christian school, and they've gone to Sunday school, and they've tried to live for the Lord, and they get up in their senior years, and they sometimes wonder, well, has it paid off? Their kids don't live for the Lord, and they're not much further ahead than they ever were, and they begin to question. They begin to question the profitability of living for the Lord. But God's promise is that in due season we shall reap. Now, sometimes God may take your children, but he may replace them 100-fold. I don't know if you know what I mean. But there are folks that don't have children, and yet through a ministry they have, maybe it's a Sunday school teacher, working some way, there may be hundreds of boys and girls that they can work with and help and serve. They don't always have to be our own flesh and blood. I've had kids to say to me, will you be my grandpa? I said, I'd be honored to be your grandpa. I mean, they don't care, right? And I don't care, see? And so we have to realize that God many times replaces these relationships 100-fold with other people. Jesus himself was teaching, and some folks came to him and said, your mother and your brethren are out here asking for you. And he said, who is my mother? And who are my brethren? And then he gestured to the crowd standing before him, and he said, behold my mother and my brothers and my sisters. See? He never felt like he was an only child. He said, for whosoever will do the will of God. And so we need to sow the right things. We need to sow for relationships. Dr. John Rawlins called me yesterday. He is 90 years old. Some of you know him. He used to pastor in Cincinnati, Ohio. He was 2 or 3 time president of the Baptist Bible Fellowship. His church averaged 5,000 for many, many years there in Cincinnati. And he's preached here. And he just called me up. He calls me Ken Boy. He's from Arkansas. I think I told you he's 90. He wanted to know, he said, are you still married to that pretty woman? He called her up one time. She answered the phone. He wanted to know if she was still married to that ugly Archie. And she said, you know, Dr. John, he ran off with some lady. Boy, that changed his tune, you know. So anyway, he called me yesterday and talked a long time. And John Rawlins probably built one of the best Sunday schools in America. And I was talking to him about Sunday school and some of the things and asking him questions. And finally, you know what he said to me? He said, you know, Brother Blue, he said, you got to have organization. But here's how he said. He said, you don't want to put too much harness on a mule because he can't pull. He said, just put enough on him so he can pull. Everybody can understand that, right? Don't put too much harness on the mule, he said. Just put enough so he can pull. And then he said, you know, a church is a family. A Sunday school class is a family. And here's what he said. 90 years old, he said, the whole key is relationships. It's all about relationships. And so friendliness, so kindness, so charity, sow those things, and you will reap those things. For whatsoever a man sows, that shall he also reap. See? And so if you want to reap the right things, you must sow the right things. Jesus himself said in Matthew chapter 4 that a man should not live by bread alone, but by every word of God. And so we want to, as we get older, you want to make sure that you don't focus all of your attention on material things. There seems to be this quest for people to try to make sure that they've got a pretty healthy nest egg when they retire. And, you know, you want to make sure you have good health. You want to make sure that, you know, that you can get by. But life is not in how much you have. Jesus himself said that a man's life does not consist of the abundance of the things he possesses. You are not going to get enough things to be happy. You're not. And the more things you have, the more things you can lose. The more things you have, the more things can go wrong. And so don't assume that because, you know, that you've got a lot of things that you're going to be a happy old person. That doesn't prove it. It's really, it's in here. It's in here. It's inside. And if we grow old graciously, regardless of our circumstances, we can be a blessing to other people. But, you know, you can walk on carpet that thick and drive a new Cadillac, but and still be miserable. John Fortune. You've heard me mention John Fortune, those of you who've been around here. I grew up with John Fortune in Wenatchee when we were teenage boys. We used to sit in the restaurant when we were about 14 and see who could tell the biggest lie. And he always won. And but I knew John. He and I grew up together. And our ways parted. I went off to Bible college. And I was walking through a place like Home Depot one day, and a lady went in front of me with a cart and just almost ran into the cart. And when I stopped, I looked at her. I knew her, but I didn't know her name. I had forgotten her name. And she said, Ken Blue. I said, yeah, but I can't remember you. She said, Marlene Fortune. And, of course, we had just started the church up in Mount Lake Terrace. And John had a roofing business, had Fortune Roofing here in the Linwood, Edmonds area, and had made hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars. I mean, he lived down on the waterfront down here off in Edmonds. I've been in his home when he was there. He had a house there. Had a house over here east of here. Had a huge indoor swimming pool. I mean, they rolled in the money. I mean, when I first started Open Door Baptist Church, I was as poor as Job's turkey. And you say, how poor was that? He was so poor he had to lean against the fence to gobble. That's how poor he was. And but you see, I was his buddy. He took us down. I told you about it. He took us down to it's that Campless restaurant down there on the end of the bridge. You know, how many of you know what I'm talking about? All you folks that spend, big spenders. It was $100 a plate. Now, this was 30-something years ago. Yeah. And one time, been there, he took me. And but I'm just trying to tell you the money that he made. He got a job. He got a contract over here on Bremerton. It was a huge contract. And he had to buy hundreds of thousands of dollars of materials to do the job. And when he got the job finished, the company wouldn't pay him. Went bankrupt. And he had all of this material bought that he couldn't pay for. He lost everything he had. Everything. In fact, his wife told me, she says, told my wife, says, I don't think I can put up with his depression anymore. He wouldn't even get out of bed. He was, for all practical purposes, a dead man. But finally he got a hold of himself. He got a job right up the road here at American Builder Supplies. Worked up there until just about 2 years ago. But he sold commercial supplies. Went out of business. He moved to Arizona. My wife and I were down there a few months ago. Went to the house to visit him. She had cancer. They'd just given her a few months to live. We sat down with them and prayed with them. And just about 30 days later, she was dead. John is my age. He's very young. And so while I was down there on vacation, I went to see him. I called him, met him. My wife and I met him in Chandler, had breakfast with him. And he cried as we sat in the restaurant as he talked. And then he took us out to the house that they had just purchased. A nice home, got a nice, I think, 3 or 4 bedroom house, and for a real $115,000. Think about that. It was a nice 3 or 4 bedroom home, 2 bath, well furnished. And we sat down for a moment, and he said, in a few minutes you're going to leave. And I got nothing but walls to look at. You see, it's not in houses. It's not in houses. It's not in bank accounts. It's not in cars. It's not in trips. It's not in travel. It's in relationships. Isn't it? I mean, a house is nothing without a family. A car is nothing if you can't share it with somebody. Life is nothing if you can't share it. But you have to start young. You have to learn how to share your life with other people. You need to learn how to help people. You need to learn to have the right attitude. You can't be jealous. You can't be envious. You can't be bitter. You can't be a gossip. If you are a gossipy teenager, and you know if you are, you will become a gossipy young lady. You will become a gossipy middle-aged woman, and you will become a gossipy old woman. You're not going to change. You better change it now. See? And we have to pray. We all have. We have problems with anger. We have problems with our tongue. We have problems with envy. We all have problems. But we need to pray that God will show us our problems. And then when those things rear their head up, we turn from them and confess them. You understand? And the more we do that and acknowledge them, the less those things will come up. See? The less they'll come up. And so thank God that some of us are living to grow old. Those of you who are young, remember, you will spend the first half of your life either making or ruining the last half. So make the best you can out of it. Be a good person. Be somebody that people like to be around. When they leave you, make them feel good that they've been in your presence. I get around some people, and not in this church. I'm not thinking of anybody, to tell you the truth, in this church tonight. But they're absent. But you know, there are folks that you've been around and you feel like you've been beat up after you leave them. You feel like you've been in a weed eater. You know, it's a mental battle just to get around them. I don't like that. Do you? I don't want to be around folks like that. And sometimes, we can't help it. Sometimes we're in situations where we don't have any control. But if you have control, but don't you be that kind of person. You know what? There was a lady that she just never could say anything bad about anybody. In fact, it upset people that she would not say anything bad about anybody. And they thought they would catch her on something. And they said to her, well, I'll bet you'd have something good to say about the devil, wouldn't you? She says, well, yeah, he's pretty consistent at what he does. I'll bet you could find good things to say about people if you wanted to. You see, stop being a fault finder. A lot of times we're just tearing other people down because we try to build ourselves up. That's the only thing. We just feel a little insecure in ourselves, and so if I can make somebody else look smaller, I feel like I'm taller. But you're really not any taller. And don't grow old like that. Grow old in grace.